Hello, in this video we're going to talk about functions, and I'm going to show you how to define a function and call a function. But first, let's make sure that you understand what a function is. Now, a function is simply a set of statements that are grouped together and given a name. And the idea behind functions is that if you have a rather large program that performs a number of different tasks, instead of writing the program as one long series of statements, you can break the program down into groups of statements that each perform a specific task. And you can make each group of statements a function. And it's just a better way of organizing a large program. Now, there are typically two steps involved in using a function. First, you have to define the function, and that is simply the process of writing the code for the function. And second, you have to call the function. At some point in the program, you'll want to execute the function, and at that point, you have to call the function. That causes it to execute. So let's look more at defining a function. On the screen, I have the general format of how you define a function in Python. You start with a line beginning with the word def, and that's a Python keyword. It simply stands for define, but it's the word def followed by a space followed by the function name. So a function name, it's kind of like a variable name. It's a name that identifies the function. And function names should also sort of describe what the function does. But this is the name of the function, followed by a set of parentheses, and then the line ends with a colon. So this first line is known as the function header. Now, following the function header, we have one or more statements that are indented. Now, these statements this is known as a block of statements, by the way. And this block of statements belongs to the function. This is the block of statements that will execute anytime the function is called. Now, the block of statements, this can be one statement, or it can be three statements, or it can be any number of statements. The set of statements that do the particular task that the function needs to perform. That's what appears here. Okay, so let's switch over to the Python interpreter in interactive mode, and let me demonstrate how to actually define a function in Python. Now, the interactive mode Python interpreter, the Python shell, is a good place to experiment with functions. You can actually define functions right here in the interactive mode interpreter. So let's do that. Let's create a function, a simple function that just displays a message on the screen. So we start with the word def, and I'm going to call the function show message, because that's what it's going to do. It's going to show a message. So I'll type the parentheses and the colon at the end of the function header. Now, notice that when I press the enter key, that the input cursor moves down to the next line, but it automatically indents. And that's because the statements that are in the block that belongs to the function, those statements have to be indented. The indentation is required because when the Python interpreter reads the function definition, it uses the indentation to know where the function ends. When the indentation ends, that's the end of the function. Okay, so this function is simply going to print the message, hello world, and that's it. So here in the interactive mode interpreter, I'll press the enter key, and this is the end of the function, so I'll press the enter key once more, and I get my prompt back. Okay, so we have now created a function named show message. So let's execute the function. Let's call the function. To do that, we simply type the name of the function with the parentheses and press enter, and you can see the output of the print statement. So when I typed this statement here, show message with the parentheses, and pressed enter, the interpreter executed the statement that is in the show message functions block. It's just one statement. It prints hello world, and there is the output. Okay, let's do another example. Let's create a function that has more than one statement. I'm going to create a function called show info, and this one is going to have more than one statement. Print, I'm going to print John Smith's information here. Not really a John Smith, just making it up. But let's say that John lives at 123 Main Street, and let's say that John's phone number is 919-555-1234. Okay, so these three statements, these are the only statements in the function. So I'm going to hit the enter key and then once more, and now we have defined a function named show info. So if I want to call this function, I simply type show info parentheses and press enter, and you can see that the interpreter executed the statements that are in this function's block. We still have the show message function, by the way. I can call it because it still exists in memory. Okay, so it might be a good idea for you to open up the Python shell, the interactive mode interpreter, and try some of this out on your own. But let's switch over now and look at a Python program that uses functions. Here we have an example program that uses a function, and in case this program looks familiar, this is from your textbook. So notice that first in these statements we have the definition of a function named message, and this function does two things. First, it prints I am Arthur, and then it prints King of the Britons. So that's a description of what the message function does. And then we have a statement that calls the message function. Now, it's important for you to understand what happens when we run this program. Okay? So the interpreter, when you run a program, the interpreter starts reading the Python code from the first statement all the way down to the last statement. Okay? And as it's reading this program, it skips over the comments, and then it says, okay, here we have a function definition. So these three statements simply create the function in memory, but they do not execute the function. After the function is created in memory, then the Python interpreter says, okay, now here we have a statement that tells me to call the message function. So then the interpreter actually executes the statements in the function. So when we run this, we will see these lines of output, I am Arthur, King of the Britons. We'll only see it come up on the screen one time. Let's try it. Okay, and there's the output. Let's look at another example. Here we have a Python program that has two functions. We have a function named main and a function named message. So let's see if we can figure out what will happen with the interpreter when we run this program. Okay, so first the interpreter will start reading the code, and it will say, okay, here we have the definition of a function named main. So these statements will create the main function in memory. Okay, now remember, nothing will be executed at this point. It just causes this function to be created. And then the interpreter continues reading the code, and it says, okay, so here we are defining another function named message. So these statements cause the message function to be created in memory. Once again, none of the statements in the function are executed. We're just creating the functions. Then the interpreter continues reading, and it sees this statement, which says, okay, we're going to call the main function. So the main function begins executing. So the first thing that happens when the main function executes is that it prints this string, I have a message for you. So let's just pretend that this area here, this is the program output. So it prints, I have a message for you. And then notice that we have a call to the message function. So the interpreter jumps to the message function and begins executing the statements that it contains. So next we print, I am Arthur, and then we print King of the Britons. Now that's the end of the message function. So when a function ends, the interpreter jumps back to the point in the program where the function was called, and it resumes executing at the very next statement. So in this case, we print goodbye, and then that's the end of the main function. So the interpreter jumps back to the statement that called the main function, and that's the end of the program. Well, let's run the program and see if that's what happens. I've got it open in my editor here, and I'm going to run the program. And there's the output.